Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I want to thank Teatro and everybody, Ryan, for the great music. That was awesome. Enjoyed that a lot. And I just want to preface my remarks with a land acknowledgement remark, as my colleague Joseph Bauer-Kemper never tires of reminding me. Our presence here today on the shores of this beautiful lake is made possible because of the 1854 treaty signed with the Ojibwe tribes, who have claim to this land, and their respect for all nations, including for the nations of our more than human kindred wildlife, is something that I think we would do all well to study and to emulate and think about that in terms of our relationship with the land tonight. So I want to take up Catherine Hayhoe's invitation from that TED Talk to have a conversation about our climate crisis. Indeed, I wish to focus our attention on one aspect of that crisis, and that is, how can our community prepare itself as a climate refuge? And related to that is a second question that I'm quite interested in, which is, would it be wise for us to assume the responsibility of making a place of refuge, or building a place of refuge, or preparing a refuge? The likelihood that we'll end up as a place of refuge seems to be very high to me, given the abundance of fresh water here and our location in the Northland. But how prepared are we for such a fate? All of us know that the possibility is not really far-fetched given what we see in the news from time to time, and I'll provide just 3 pieces of evidence to that effect. In the summer of 2018, Sodankila, Finland, registered a record-breaking 90-degree temperature, which is astonishing because this town in Finland is 59 miles north of the Arctic Circle. That same summer, on the 28th of June, 2018, Oman got in on the fun with a 109-degree reading that amazed meteorologists, because that wasn't the day's high temperature, that was the low temperature. It was the hottest low temperature ever recorded on Earth. Then just this week, I read on Google News that Doha, Qatar, who's hosting the 2022 World Cup, is now developing plans to air-condition outdoor spaces, football stadiums, pavements, and outdoor areas of shopping malls, because it's too hot to be outside. So I don't have to be a climate scientist, and indeed I'm not one, but to see that for all intents and purposes, it appears that we're entering into a feedback loop when it comes to climate change. And I think the early signs of that seem to be readily apparent. Air conditioning the outside is kind of like having a sump pump in your basement that discharges into its own drain tile. And I can talk about that because I had that experience once. When my sump pump was going off and the water was going out of the house, and then a couple minutes later I'd hear it trickling back into the house, into the basement. In fact, I could even see it coming down the basement walls. This is not a good situation to be in. More air conditioning is not a viable solution to global warming or to global heating. You all could come up with your own assortment of facts, but so here we are now. About 3 or 4 years ago, I started thinking about the climate crisis in greater earnest. And I started thinking sometimes as I was mowing the lawn, I'd think about what would it be like to be a place of refuge for people. And I thought, how ready do you think we are, both individually and collectively, for an influx of people? And what would it mean to be ready for such a fate? And how long do we have to prepare? And what does preparing even look like? My initial thoughts revolved around structures. As I say, I would mow the lawn, I'd think, I'd look at a garage my neighbor has, I think, I wonder how many people could live in that garage if we converted it to a bunkhouse. I'd think about the woods being turned into campgrounds and so on. It was only later, after 2016, and upon greater reflection, that I began to realize that housing people was the easy part. Making room psychologically, politically, intellectually, spiritually for such newcomers was going to be the real challenge. How ready am I as an individual to live in a place with a far greater population density? Could we as individuals and as a community welcome 1,000 climate refugees? Or 10,000 climate refugees? Or in 20 years, 1 million climate refugees? Could our political system stand such a stress? Could our infrastructural, educational, religious, legal, and other public institutions weather a kind of influx like that from all over the country, or even from all over our hemisphere? What if the crisis on our southern border right now is already a function of a heating planet? Many signs point to this fact. What if what's happening at the southern border of our nation were happening on the southern border of our community. Imagine a wall being built just south of Cloquet to keep people out of the cooler temperatures and the cool water. Imagine that for a second. You'd think now, as a communication scholar, that I would have got to this point quicker than I did. I'm a little slow. But one of the root words for the word communication, and also to related words like the word comrade, is the idea that we share things in common, that we can make things in common, and especially in a common room or in a shared space. A comrade is a roommate, really, literally. It has this additional connotation of a gift. Certainly the gift of living in the Northland for the last 15 years and raising my children here is an inestimable one that I wish people could share in. Yet if I'm honest with myself, how many people? And in what conditions of urgency might they arrive? All of this got me thinking about building a place of refuge. What is a refuge? What does the concept mean? From its Latin roots, the word means to escape or to flee, and it's akin to the word fugitive. I think the best description of a refuge is a hideaway, a place of safety, a place of concealment, of shelter, of evasion from wrath and from storm, a place of retreat, of sanctuary. I hope that all of us, I'm sure, are going to go to such a place in a few hours. We're going to be really grateful for it. The word refugee is one who seeks a place of refuge. It was first used in English in 1628 to describe Protestant Huguenots fleeing persecution in France. The word generally refers to any involuntary, uprooted, and homeless person who has crossed the frontier and who no longer possesses the protection of her former government. The technical and legal definition of a refugee is one who's fleeing violence, most often the result of religious or racial intolerance. The expulsion of Jews from Spain in the 15th century, the exodus of Huguenots from France in the 17th century, the eviction of Jews from Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland in the 20th century are all well-known examples of violent persecution that creates refugees. One of the most influential political philosophers of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt, was herself a Jewish refugee. She once wrote, in the first place, we don't like to be called refugees. We ourselves call each other newcomers or immigrants. We're not only prospective citizens, but present enemy aliens. We became witnesses and victims of worse terrors than death, without having been able to discover a higher ideal than life. Thus, although death lost its horror for us, we became neither willing nor capable to risk our lives for a cause. Instead of fighting or thinking about how to become able to fight back, refugees have got used to wishing death to friends or relatives. If somebody dies, we cheerfully imagine all the trouble, he's been saved, close quote. In this quotation, you can hear the refugees, the newcomers, the prospective citizens' insane optimism, which is next door to despair, she writes. No one wants to be a refugee. No one wants to be driven from their home or to have their life threatened or to be cast on the mercy of strangers. And nearly everything we know about refugees, everything we think and that we know how to say about them, grows out of this 20th century context of people fleeing political, religious, and racial violence. It's only recently that we've begun to think, I think, about people being displaced by causes incident to our climate crisis. Indeed, recent events in Syria and Central American countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala may have their roots in both political violence and climate change. Heat and heat waves may well become the biggest challenge facing humanity all around the world. As temperatures rise, hurricanes become more violent, fires ravage city and countryside alike, and so on. So having only a brief amount of time available, I wish to lay out some principles to guide our thinking and talking with reference to climate refugees. The first thing that any refugee needs, and needs quickly, is safety. The second thing they must have eventually is autonomy, both economic and political. A refugee has a different status than a migrant, and there's a lot of confusion about this in our republic today. Migrant is one who moves to have a better life. A refugee is not fleeing poverty. A refugee is fleeing danger. This is precisely where things get really tricky. Consider this example from Alexander Betts and Paul Collier. Suppose a man leaves his house, walks down the street, and knocks randomly on the door of another house, your house. As it happens, he demands to live with you. You question his right to do so. He points out that he has a right to live with you. You question his right to do so again. He points out that he has a right to leave his own house. You have to agree with him. So it must follow, he says, that he has a right to live in your house. And you do not accept this. Indeed, you may start to worry that he's a little mad. However, you might begin to ponder whether you have a duty to rescue him. Are you safe at home, you ask? If he isn't safe, then someone should rescue him, though hopefully not yourself. Yes, I'm safe, but it's damp and it's cold in my house and pretty unpleasant compared to your house. This does not sound very compelling, close quote. Again, it's one thing to understand that one has a right to leave their home for any reason. It's when they knock on your door and ask to live in your home that the real challenge sets in. Very few recognize any right for a person to live in someone else's home. Countries are generally thought of in the same terms, with a right to forbid entry to any person for any reason. Yet the matter of refugee status does change this considerably in terms of international law. I'm not a lawyer, but what I understand is that historically we are at a difficult time with respect to the evolution of the law because our international frameworks were again built around the refugee crisis of the 20th century, which may have a questionable relevance for the coming 21st century crises. Yet at the same time that we struggle to sort out what to do legally with migrants and refugees alike, we also need to think and come to terms with our duty to rescue, whether we have such a duty, and what it means for us collectively. As far as the law is concerned, it generally imposes no duty to rescue. Indeed, if a person starts to rescue someone, they actually have an obligation to rescue them in a non-negligent way. So for example, imagine if someone has a seizure and collapses in the street. So long as you're not their parent or their guardian, and you're not a first responder with the legal duty to rescue them, you don't have a legal duty to pull them to safety. However, once you start to pull them to safety, you have to finish the job. You can't pull them halfway out of the street, halfway to the sidewalk, and then leave them to get run over in the street. This suggests then for us, if we're going to prepare a climate refuge, we'd better be smart about it and use our heads and not just our hearts. And indeed, it should be a serious question first whether or not it's a wise thing to undertake to do in the face of everyone else doing nothing. It's a terrifying prospect to imagine that once we start to build a refuge for those seeking to escape the heat, we may indeed have a duty to finish building such a place. In their book Refuge, Rethinking Refugee Policy in a Changing World, Alexander Betts and Paul Collier think it wise, as do I, to consider the moral and ethical duty to rescue, not just our legal duty. Our common shared humanity, together with principles of compassion, are the root of our moral duty to rescue. We should at the same time be prudent and work to share the burdens of rescue as widely as possible, while harnessing the potential of different capabilities in different places, institutions, and organizations, etc. Working in solidarity, we can accomplish far more than we can working in isolation. Partnerships of all kinds will be required if hundreds of thousands of people flee their homes to escape the devastation of global heating. The great hothouse we've created means that they are coming. It's probably only a matter of time. Should we find ways to offer safe harbor? That's a question we can answer collectively only. In this case, it's likely that there may be no realistic return to their homes or places of origin. That is to say, the offer of a refuge may be permanent. So we can quickly get to a place where our ability to absorb new people is overwhelmed and we're inundated with problems that are beyond our capacity to solve. As I say, refugees need safety and autonomy. They need security from harm that they're fleeing and an opportunity to work and to provide for themselves. If we see refugees only in humanitarian terms and not in human terms, we're likely to fail to deliver to them what they most need, which is not handouts but a hand up, which is not living in limbo forever as a refugee, but the opportunity for full-fledged belonging. In the meantime, the logistics of making room for others will be highly political. And if the worst-case scenarios play out, the challenge will require the cooperation of our entire community. To welcome is to greet others gladly and hospitably. It's to find or make a place for them and to provide them with a feeling that they're not a burden. This summer, my wife and I, we've lived here for 15 years, as I mentioned, in Duluth, and nobody ever comes to see us. And for some reason, all our friends and family decided this was the summer to come. So we entertained house guests, I think, just about every week of the summer, and it was a lot of fun. It was a blast because it was all people that we love and that we know and wanted to see. But you know as well as I do that the line between being a host and hostility is a fine one. There's a great image of Abraham painted by Rembrandt, in which Abraham's sitting at a table for dinner. He's hosting these three strangers who have wandered into his tent, and he's holding a knife, but the knife is a butter knife. So you kind of think he's posed sort of halfway there between trying to be a good host and some hostility. It's a problem that we all face. What kind of reception can we offer? The concept of welcome is, of course, a species of hospitality, which extends far beyond the moment of reception to include the whole scope of one's relationship and dealings with the other, the stranger, the newcomer, the wayfarer. Feigning joy at the moment of reception is one thing. If we're plotting intrigue or destruction, that's not at all akin to genuine hospitality. Our lives are part of a fabric of learning to welcome in various kinds of ways. Whether it's welcoming a newborn baby into our home, or welcoming a new colleague to our department, or meeting new acquaintance for the first time, all of these instances are moments that call for hospitality, that demand a different degree of welcome, certainly, but different levels of commitment and interaction. In the case of a newborn, we may enter into obligations that span lifetimes, as our children beget children, who we may need to welcome later on. While all kinds of obligations ensue in the territory of hospitality, our lives are also deeply impoverished if we avoid these obligations or fail to fulfill them with kindness and generosity. Hospitality relates closely to justice. Justice is giving other people what they deserve, and of course other people deserve welcome. They deserve this by virtue of their shared occupancy of planet Earth. Their existence is their right, and we owe them that, at the very least. As to the limits of that right, whether it means they have a right to exist merely, or a right of way, a right of passage, a right to a piece of the earth, or a right to sit on your couch or to sleep in your bed, is quite a different matter. This least that we can do, perhaps, to offer something grudgingly and abominably in a wretched and stingy kind of way is not, I think, what hospitality means. The posture we adopt towards others is part of the choices we make toward them, and it reveals a lot about our own character. The selfish and the self-absorbed, of course, have a hard time making room for others, but even generous souls have limits, to be sure. Thus, we're faced with choices. How do we as a community wish to think about our role in either welcoming or forbidding others from being welcomed? How will we as a community choose to act if others start coming here to seek refuge? This is not the sort of problem that can be solved with a business plan or a clever marketing slogan or even a new city flag. As worthy as those things may be, in some contexts, they're unlikely to offer sufficient substance for the kind of work that I'm suggesting might need to happen if Duluth de facto becomes a place of refuge. It may become a place of refuge because refugees come here. And come here not because it's a cool place in the figurative sense, but because it's literally a cool place to be. It may also become a refuge more or less strategically or haphazardly, depending on what we as a community choose to do about this climate crisis, what responsibilities we assume or deny for ourselves and for this place and for our own lives. I am, of course, like Catherine Hayhoe, hopeful that we can be alive to possibilities as they arise, and that we will embrace the shared burdens associated with caring for this place, its water, its people, its climate, and so on. I'm hopeful that we'll do that for all places, and that global heating need not become a global disaster. Thank you.
So I'll let you gather your thoughts for a moment, and I'll go to you in the audience and ask you your questions in a minute. I think, so here's my honest piece of feedback for a second, or a question. I mean, I love what you're saying. Sort of. I think on a fundamental level, though, I'm kind of first mad at those who are most responsible for making climate change or not taking climate change seriously. And so to open my home is okay. But I'm thinking about the people that have the money, who created the situation, who can move away to wherever else that they would want to go. And so what's sort of the glow, I mean, this is totally passing the buck, but you know, the people who have taken advantage of the situation and just get to get away with it because they're rich and they get to do that. Is that a fair first question?
Well, I don't know, you might not like my answer. You might not like my answer. It's a fair question, but here's the problem.
There isn't a way.
What's that?
There isn't an way.
There isn't an away, she says, and I agree. Yes, I think if I know what you're saying, I agree. But so if we divide the world into thirds, 1/3 of the world's population can afford to buy an airline ticket, and 2/3 of the world's population cannot. If you're in the 1/3 who can afford to buy an airline ticket, and undoubtedly you probably are because you're here tonight, you are the rich who are benefiting from climate change and who are using the climate more than the other 2/3. So if we start there, then we also have to ask ourselves, and I'm not a booster for oil companies, don't get me wrong, but I listened to an economist podcast the other day in which the president of, I think, ExxonMobil was making some pretty convincing arguments to me about how people who use fossil fuels are as much to blame as the fossil fuel companies who provide them. So I don't know how helpful it would be for us to think about blame when it's shared so widely, and it's been happening for such a long time, and also it's a really complicated story because if you really look at the pollution of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, that starts at a time of about 1800 when economic growth really explodes in Western countries. And that's, if you go back to that time for my people anyway, we would have been peasant farmers in Northern Europe. And I'm not sure that's not a better choice than facing a climate, an existential climate crisis. I might want to go back to those ancestors. They might have known something I've forgotten. But at the same time, that growth has come very, very quickly, technologically, and almost in some ways has outpaced our ethical thinking about how to respond and how to solve these problems. So I think it's more complicated than being able to say that those other people are to blame and we're not to blame. And also at this point we may be running out of time for that game. Like that question might have made sense 50 years ago in the 1970s. I'm not sure it does anymore. And so I guess I'm struck by the urgency of the situation, the feeling like in the last 3 years that, boy, it's getting worse fast. I don't know if that answers your question. But
I don't like your answer, but
I told you
but it's a good answer.
I told you wouldn't.
All right, so let's go to the question, or the audience for a question. Yeah. You, handsome guy in the gray sweater.
Nice gray sweater.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Gore, I'm wondering about the limits of the metaphor that we're using to think about this of the house. So, Lakoff and Johnson, they talk about the metaphor of the family in terms of politics. How we use if we think about politics in terms of the family, what kind of discipline do we want in the family kind of things? Conservatives tend to be more disciplinarian, liberals more concerned about justice. But here, I think you're referencing Codier and a colleague, and there's this house metaphor, which fits really well with that, for the way that we think about politics in the nation, and this country, our borders, as being sort of the limits of the house,
The walls,
our property.
Yeah.
And so, I'm wondering what the limits are of that, of us thinking about it on these terms, and if there's a different way for us to think about it. I was just talking to your colleague, Ryan Goey, this morning about the way that the West thinks about home and the East thinks about home, in terms of the East being, what's more structured hierarchically within the house, within the space, but the spaces are much more open, and the West being individual spaces for each person has their own space, and a child can shut out the parent as you have to respect me, this is my space, not before you come in, sort of thing, which much more dominates the way that we think about this, our home space. And if we're using this as a way of talking about refugees I have a right to refuse you, you don't have a right to come in, you have to knock, I have to give you permission, this sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I had a really brilliant answer that I forgot while you were talking. So I apologize for that. But, I think you're right that the metaphor of the house is problematic. I'll grant you that. And it's not a perfect metaphor. Oh yes, I remember. Cicero says that a nation of people or a commonwealth is a group of people who share a view of justice and the common good. And if we think about that, then I guess that's the limits. That is the limit of the household metaphor, because do we agree with the other people in this community about what justice is? And do we share a vision of the common good? Do we care about the general welfare enough to say, you know what, this is more important than I am. I've got to give up my own interests for the good of the group. And I think that's ultimately the question that's at stake here. For both refugees and people who want to provide for refugees, because as I say, like any person who's a guest can overstay their welcome or can abuse the hospitality that's offered to them. So it isn't just a matter of us creating places or spaces. I think the problem that I go back to in terms of why the metaphor isn't limited is that we all need a house. We can't really live even in the nicest places, I suppose. Well, and I don't even know, the Bahamas or something. They still have houses. They still have roofs, and they still have, obviously, yeah. So I don't know. In that sense, a refuge is literally a place, a hideaway, somewhere to go to get some cover. And I guess we all need that in that sense. That's one of the needs we have as human beings. So I guess I would go back to that, but to that question about how much do we share in common, and how much do we care about the same idea of justice? And I think there's a lot of good evidence right now that we don't have that agreement about justice, that it's not as robust as we might want it to be in the public space. And so then that's why I think this video is cool, because we got to talk about that. We got to talk about what it means to do justice to other people and to share a vision of what's good together. That's more important than the walls. Yeah.
So
That's loud.
I'll try to be loud here, but I met my first climate refugees this spring.
Yeah.
I had an office in Grand Marais. A couple brought their dog in. I'm a vet. And where are you from? Paradise, California. I said, did it affect you?
Yeah.
They said, we have our car and our dog. So it happens.
It does.
My question is that I respect Dr. Hayhoe very, very much.
Me too.
And I think she's absolutely right in her question, her statement that we need to talk about it. But as you just mentioned, the urgency is really there. And my question to you and to everybody else in this audience is, how do you transition from the talk to actually getting something done? And I'm not talking about things that are just outward statements to your community or to the world, but actually getting things done. So I'm talking politically. I think it's important for people to do things on an individual basis, but even more importantly, to work together on a national and international basis to get something done. Can you respond to that, please?
I can try.
Can I just ask, did all you folks over here? Okay, great. Go ahead.
Excellent, thanks. So first of all, I guess my first response would be, as a communication professor, that in fact talking is doing something. So the distinction that you're making between talking and doing is not as clear, I think, as you want it to be, either in a theoretical sense or in a practical sense, right? So that there are ways for us to act with symbols that are quite profound, and that might even be more profound than doing something. In fact, what might be important for us to do is nothing. In the sense that maybe what we need is a way to reconceptualize our relationship to Earth and to life and to experience in terms of, maybe if we did a little more thinking and a little less doing, we might have less climate problems, if that makes any sense, So it's because I think the irony here, this same thing happened to me. I was invited to give a talk at a university, Southern Utah University, earlier this spring about climate change. It's crazy. I traveled out there, and like wow. So, and obviously we all know air travel is very, very wasteful, and a high producer of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's all kinds of irony abounds, and I want to just point that out. Otherwise, though, I think you're right that not every problem is a communication problem, right? And if you, to use another metaphor that one of my favorite professors, Wayne Booth, uses in his book, The Rhetoric of Rhetoric, he says, you know, when terrorists stand up and start storming the cockpit, that's not a good time to stand up from your seat and say, guys, can we talk about this? Like, there's a certain point where you're right. I mean, we run out of time to talk. But we also have to keep in mind also Kenneth Burke's admonition to us that human beings build their cultures by huddling, nervously loquacious on the edge of an abyss. We've always been in a situation where what we have is to talk. That's maybe the only thing that we have to some extent. The most important thing we have is talking, not doing. And that ability to huddle sort of nervously loquacious in that sense is something that we can't say that doing is more important than that. That is one of the things that's most fundamental that we do. So I'm just trying to problematize the concept of talking for a second. But again, you're absolutely right that as is Greta Thunberg?
Yes.
She's brilliant, and she's a brilliant talker, but she also said, you know, the only thing that matters here is whether we stop putting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere or we don't. And we're accelerating the rate, right? And so the most disturbing thing that I read the other day was that energy use in 2018 in the United States went up by about 3.7%, and it was all attributed to weather events. People used their air conditioners more because it was hot, and they used their heaters more because it was cold. So that's that sump pump model that I think we're in now, and we're doing far too little, far too slowly. So I don't disagree with your call for action. I just want to problematize it, but also say that you're right. If we don't start emitting fewer greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we're in trouble. We're already in trouble from it. Yeah?
Can I follow up?
Please.
So,
That's all right.
My concern
Sure.
is that I agree with you that talk is really very important.
Yeah.
But in my job, when people just talk, my patients either live or die unless I do something.
Yes.
All right. Same thing goes with this disease planet as well.
Sure.
So my concern again is how do you motivate people to go beyond talking and to certainly use discourse, but then to move toward action?
I think that's an important question. I do, and I'm not being facetious. I'm not. I do think it's an important question. I guess I would. So a part of me wants to be, maybe this is snarky, but I mean, but your patients all die.
Would they all die?
And they all die.
Oh,
We're
they
all
all
gonna
do,
die.
yes, exactly.
So then I come back to wanting to philosophize, wanting to think in the face of death, wanting to think together about how we can make our lives meaningful while they last. Because what you're doing is prolonging them to die another day, and I don't disagree with everything else you said. I mean, I think it's important to think in terms of our actions, right? So I like just really simple things that I'm doing, like she suggested. I cut my lawn a lot longer than I used to. It doesn't look as nice as it used to, but I'm happier about it. And I think my son is too, because he has to push the mower less often. So I think there are things we can do that are simple and small that make a big difference. Conversely, I mean, you might think of it as a small thing to fertilize your lawn, but that's not a small thing. There's real repercussions for all of us. So I think we've got to get serious about the talking and about the action at the same time. And I think I'd be open to hearing your answer maybe afterwards about how we turn talking into action. I think that's a fundamental human problem.
We do have pitchforks and torches out in the atrium. We're all going to take to the streets. I'm going to go to Lisa right here.
I just wonder, yes, I'm action oriented as well, like that. But I also am a talker. I've been talking about climate change for like a while, but not in a different context. I've been talking with people in Duluth, and I wonder if you have some ideas for like what we can do, concrete actions, some thoughts about what to do in Duluth locally. So a little bit the same question as Mike, who asked on an international and national level. I asked if you have ideas of actions in Duluth, because when I talk to people, they want to do something. By and large, I meet very few people who don't. But to say, well, we'll recycle more. You know, that isn't, we're beyond recycling. So, I don't know,
Yeah.
I have thoughts and ideas on that. Like, what do we do locally?
We're back to the practical, Dr.
I
Gore.
don't know, you're pushing me into a space I don't know how to handle.
And you don't need to make me uncomfortable.
No, I'm not, well, I'm uncomfortable, that's okay, I'm happy to do that. I wanna be uncomfortable, I want us all to be uncomfortable about it on some level, so I think that's an important question, but again, I think, I don't wanna offer useless platitudes here, and I don't wanna make suggestions about things we can do, like, don't use plastic or whatever, because, I mean, I'm only trying to do those things myself now, and it's the first time I've thought about that in most of my life. I've been, thoughtless. And so I guess I want to think more, and I want to be more thoughtful. And I agree with you that, if we think that recycling is, that we're doing our part, then we're missing the point of the kind of crisis we're facing. And I think realizing that and thinking that and understanding that is crucial to where we're at. So I don't, I know that's not a great answer to your question, but I'm sure other people have better answers. I know there are like 3 questions here. Where should I go? You were most urgent, yeah.
I got one. That was really
Go
urgent.
for it.
No microphone. The question, or here's the question, and fun little anecdote first.
Yeah.
It was the last hurricane. My sister lives in the Intercoastal in
Yeah.
Miami, in a very lovely home. Has to have $200,000 worth of windows that come down, so they protect your windows.
Yeah.
So it's steel. And it wasn't until that trip they took up north in Florida that her husband from Venezuela discovered that she had 2 ferrets, a cat, and a dog that he never knew of in her home. What my question is to you is it more political or is it more climate warming change that's going on? Political or more right now to the United States, or political, yes or no? Venezuela is a very disrupted,
Yeah. I mean, if I understand what you're asking, I guess I would say that we are facing. I think the crisis we're facing is a political one, to be sure, and it's related to global heating, and so they're related to each other because the global heating is caused by our politics, by what we support politically,
so force or hurt.
Yes, that's precisely the kind of problem we're facing.
All right.
And I think sorting that out might not matter if as long as we can pay attention to greenhouse gas emissions.
He can't go back. His family can't go back.
Yeah.
They cannot go back to this political climate.
I see. Yeah, in Venezuela, you mean?
They have air conditioning.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I think there's a host of problems that we're facing, and I think we have to be on guard to realize that the whole thing is political, because we're political animals by our nature. You had a question here.
Yeah, been all about climate change for a long time, and it was brought up in a little group I had breakfast with, and there was a firestorm of pushback on these 2 or 3 guys that were convinced that it's all a big hoax. I don't know, so I thought, well, I do a little research, so I went to the library and got a few books, and I did some reading.
Good.
Have you considered the other element, which is the natural cycles of the earth that goes through the
Absolutely.
Pleistocene period, and
Sure.
then we're in the Holocene period now,
Yeah.
which is still could happen.
Without a doubt, climate change is a natural phenomenon.
But the last several years, we on this upswing.
Correct.
And they attribute that to
To human behavior.
the human behavior.
Yeah, I concur with that judgment. Not being a climate scientist myself, I think there's no doubt that this is a consequence of human action right now. You had a question here, Ryan?
I did, yeah.
You
We're
wanna
gonna
ask
do
it?
one more after this, and then we'll be.
Okay.
Then you can buy us drinks in the atrium.
I'm gonna try really hard to ask this, my question intelligently.
I'll try really hard to answer it.
Thank you. I really appreciate your willingness to look at this this issue with complexity.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminds me of an essay I've recently read. I'm currently auditing a French class, and I'm sitting in and I'm working on a Master of Social Work, and it reminds me of an essay by Sartre called L'Honte, which the French word for guest is the same word for host. And so I guess my question with that, we had a really interesting conversation about that in class, but I grew up, I'm a very privileged person. I grew up with a great family, and I grew up with a parent who provided therapeutic foster care for kids. And I think I agree with you about the need for relationship and talking. And I have friends from all over the political spectrum, and I've lost friends who I served in the military with, who I once trusted with my life, who don't like me because I'm not conservative enough. And I've lost friends for not being liberal enough. And so I guess the heart of my question is, in our conversation, how do we avoid tribalism? How do we avoid othering other people? I think this image of the host and the guest being the same thing is really relevant, that we are all just us. And it's really, really hard not to do that. I have a hard time not doing that to people. But I feel like that's a part of being able to converse and being able to do something.
That's a brilliant comment and question. And I think for my part, I suppose I'm quite drawn to the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. In particular, his essay, God and Philosophy, he says that there are some people who exemplify being in for themselves, and there are those who exemplify being for others. And I think what you're talking about is how can we be for others? Because ultimately, you're right, the tribalism and the disagreement and the contention that we see all around us in our society today, in our culture, is part of the problem that I think Heyo's talking about, that I'm talking about. It's part of the problem with the way we relate to the earth itself, and to the things that we are making and the way we're making them and to how we're living. And so there's no doubt that this is a crisis that strikes right at the heart of every one of us in terms of how we want to treat other people and how we want to be treated. And fundamentally, I think you're absolutely right that we're all going to struggle with that. But I guess I would go back to one's fundamental orientation to the other. Is that about yourself? You know, if I say I love you, and I mean that I love you because of what you do for me, I love you for my sake, then I've missed the point of love. And if I say I love you and I mean I'm glad you exist for your own sake and in your own right, then I know what I'm saying when I say it. And so we have to learn how to say that in the right way, and then we have to really take a close look at ourselves and ask ourselves if we really mean it when we say it. That I love you for your own sake and not for my sake. Because loving ourselves is the thing that comes so naturally, so readily, so instantly. And it's the lifelong battle of, I think, of ethical action is to work past that and to be a mature person who can love people for their own rights, for their own sake.
Like that. I'm going to go back to Dr. Joy in the back row.
Hey, Dr. Gore. People have been pressing you a lot for practical solutions tonight.
You're gonna do it again.
I'm going to do it again, but I'm also going to ask you, as it pertains to your discussion, because your discussion wasn't about the science of climate change or changing emissions.
Yep.
Your discussion was about how we might respond as a community to climate refugees. So, what about practical solutions or discussions or spaces for discussions might we have in Duluth as it pertains to that topic specifically?
Teatro, right here. We're in such a space. And I think another way to say that is we're always in such a space. And that kind of goes back to Ryan's point too, do we have a willingness to engage other people? You know, do we have a willingness to correct other people? But I mean to say the right thing if the wrong thing is said. Are we ready to speak the truth when it needs to be spoken? Are we ready to ask the right kinds of questions? You know, because your question's a good question, and anytime we ask a question, anytime we pose a question to ourselves or to others, we're creating space for an answer. So again, I think it goes also back to this concept of how do we create these spaces in order to engage each other. And I think what my answer would be that we're always in those spaces, and we're always either creating or destroying those spaces depending on how we treat other people, depending on our interactions, depending on our willingness to give the time that it deserves to the question, so to speak. So, I mean, again, that's not a very practical response, but I think it's a right way to orient ourselves theoretically. And after all, living theoretically is the most practical thing of all, because it allows us to examine ourselves in the situations that we're in.
So I think so you did this book study group that some folks were a part of.
Yes.
Is that happening again? Because it sounds like people have an interest in something practical.
It has been renewed by my colleagues, Dr. Aaron Boyce and Dr. Michael Fowler, sitting right here in the front row. And they are the heads of that research collaborative now. And you could talk to Michael Fowler, I think, afterwards about whether you wanted to join. We're always looking for people interested.
Yeah, if you're looking to connect with other people around that same question, put your name or email address on that list and say, I'm interested, and I'll connect all of you together and someone will do something with that. Does that sound all right? All right, Dr. Gore, thank you.
Thank you.